You're standing in a dimly lit chamber. The year is 1515. You've been accused of a crime you didn't commit. The executioner slowly opens a tall, human-shaped cabinet in front of you. Inside, you see dozens of iron spikes pointing inward. He gestures for you to step inside. Your heart races. You know what happens next. The door closes. The spikes pierce your body from all directions. You die in agony. Except, none of that ever happened. Because here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. The Iron Maiden, the most infamous torture device in history, the one that's been featured in countless horror movies, video games, and museum exhibits, was never actually used to torture anyone. Not once. Not ever. And today I'm going to prove it to you. What you're about to discover is one of history's greatest hoaxes. A lie so compelling, so perfectly crafted, that it fooled the entire world for over 200 years. We're talking about historians, museum curators, authors, filmmakers. Everyone bought into this story. And the craziest part? The people who created this elaborate deception did it for reasons that are almost as fascinating as the lie itself. But before we expose the truth, we need to understand the legend. Because the Iron Maiden didn't become one of the most feared torture devices in popular culture by accident. There's a psychology to it, a dark appeal that says something profound about human nature and our relationship with history's darkest moments. So buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through medieval Europe, Victorian Germany, and the shadowy corners of human imagination. We're going to meet the people who created this myth, the victims of the real torture methods that actually existed, and the modern detectives who finally uncovered the truth. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at museum exhibits the same way again. Let's start with what most people believe about the Iron Maiden. According to popular legend, the Iron Maiden was a medieval torture device that emerged somewhere in Germany during the Dark Ages. Picture a cabinet or sarcophagus, roughly the size and shape of a human body, made of iron or wood reinforced with iron. The inside was lined with spikes. Some versions claim dozens of them. Others say hundreds. The way it supposedly worked was absolutely diabolical. The accused person would be forced inside the cabinet while it was open. Then, slowly, and this is key to the horror of it, the door would be closed. Not quickly, which might kill you instantly. No, slowly. Inch by inch. The spikes would penetrate the body gradually, positioned carefully to avoid hitting vital organs immediately. The victim would suffer for hours, even days, as they bled out internally. Some versions of the legend claim there were holes at the bottom to let the blood drain out. Others say there were spikes positioned specifically to pierce the eyes. The most elaborate versions describe a victim who could be kept alive inside for extended periods, their screams echoing from within the iron shell. Pretty horrifying, right? And here's what makes the legend even more chilling. It had a name. Not just Iron Maiden, but specifically the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. This wasn't some vague medieval torture device from somewhere in Europe. It had a precise location, a specific identity. There was supposedly a famous one in Nuremberg, Germany, and it was allegedly used during the height of the medieval period and the Inquisition. The story goes that this particular Iron Maiden was used to torture and execute criminals, heretics, and witches. Some accounts claim it was used during the witch trials. Others link it to the persecution of religious minorities. The details vary, but the core story remains the same. People died horrible deaths inside this contraption. Now, if you've visited certain museums in Europe or seen collections of medieval torture devices, you might be thinking, wait, but I've seen an Iron Maiden. It's real. It's right there in the museum. And that's exactly the problem. Because what you saw was real, a real object, made of real iron, standing right there in 3 dimensions. But here's the question nobody asks. When was it made? And more importantly, why was it made? Before we get to the truth, let's talk about why this legend is so believable. Because understanding why we fell for this hoax tells us something fascinating about ourselves. First, there's the confirmation bias factor. We know the medieval period was brutal. We have extensive documentation of actual torture methods that were used. The rack, the wheel, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering. These weren't myths. They really happened. So when someone tells us about the Iron Maiden, it fits perfectly into our existing mental model of medieval cruelty. It sounds exactly like something they would do. Second, there's what psychologists call emotional plausibility. The Iron Maiden isn't just any torture device. It's specifically designed in a way that triggers our deepest fears. The confined space appeals to our claustrophobia. The slow, inevitable closing of the door creates a sense of helpless anticipation. The multiple penetration points hit our fear of being pierced or impaled. It's almost too perfectly horrifying, like it was designed by a horror screenwriter rather than a medieval executioner. And that's your first clue, by the way. When something seems perfectly designed to horrify us, perfectly crafted to hit every psychological fear button we have. Maybe it was designed, just not by who we think. Third, there's the power of physical evidence. This is huge. We're not talking about some story passed down through oral tradition. We're talking about actual Iron Maidens that you can see and touch in museums. Physical objects carry an authority that stories don't. When you stand in front of a 7-foot-tall iron cabinet covered in spikes, your brain doesn't think, hoax. It thinks, holy shit, they really did this to people. But here's what's wild. Just because an object exists doesn't mean it was used the way the label says it was. I could build a medieval telephone booth right now, age it with some acid and rust, and in 200 years people might believe medieval peasants used it to make calls. The existence of the object proves only that the object exists or not when it was made or why or how it was used. And finally, there's the appeal of dark tourism. Let's be honest, we're fascinated by humanity's capacity for cruelty. That's why torture museums are popular. That's why true crime podcasts are booming. That's why you're watching this video right now. We want to peek into the darkness, to understand the worst things humans have done to each other, maybe to reassure ourselves that we've evolved beyond such barbarism. The Iron Maiden gives us that peek. It's tangible, visual, and shocking. It's the perfect exhibit, which is exactly why someone invented it. So when did historians first start questioning the Iron Maiden's authenticity? The cracks in the story started appearing in the late 20th century, but to understand the full truth, we need to go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, the era when the Iron Maiden legend really took off. Here's a crucial fact. There are no medieval references to the Iron Maiden. None. Think about that for a second. We have extensive medieval records. We have torture manuals. Yes, those existed, and they're exactly as disturbing as you'd imagine. We have legal documents describing executions in graphic detail. We have illustrated manuscripts showing various torture devices. We have court records, confessions, witness testimonies, and executioners' journals. And in all of these sources, spanning hundreds of years across multiple countries, not a single mention of an Iron Maiden. The first confirmed reference to an Iron Maiden doesn't appear until the late 18th century. And it doesn't appear in a legal document or a historical record. It appears in a travel book. The first widely circulated Iron Maiden story comes from a philosopher named Johann Philipp Siebenkees, who wrote about the execution of a coin forger in 1515 in Nuremberg. According to Siebenkees, this criminal was placed inside an Iron Maiden and died within hours. Sounds pretty definitive, right? A specific date, a specific crime, a specific location. Except researchers have gone through the Nuremberg court records from 1515. Guess what they found? Nothing. No execution of a coin forger. No mention of an Iron Maiden. The event Siebenkees described simply didn't happen. So where did he get the story? This is where it gets interesting. Siebenkees was writing during the Romantic period, an era obsessed with medieval history, Gothic horror, and the dark appeal of the past. Authors during this time weren't always strict about distinguishing between historical fact and creative embellishment. They were storytellers, and a good story was often more valuable than a true one. But Siebenkees' account might have been forgotten if it hadn't been for what happened next. Someone built one. In the 19th century, probably around the 1840s, an Iron Maiden appeared at a museum in Nuremberg. And then another one showed up somewhere else. And then another. Within a few decades, Iron Maidens were popping up in collections across Europe. And here's the crucial question. If these were authentic medieval devices, where had they been for the previous 500 years? Why did they all suddenly emerge during the same 50-year period in the 19th century? The answer is uncomfortable for museums that still display them, because that's when they were made. To understand why someone would create fake torture devices, we need to understand the 19th century obsession with medieval history. This was the era of Sir Walter Scott's novels, of Gothic revival architecture, of a romanticized vision of the Middle Ages that bore little resemblance to reality. Europeans were simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by their medieval past. They wanted to believe in noble knights and grand castles, but they also wanted to believe in dungeons and torture chambers. The darkness made the light seem brighter. The cruelty of the past made the civilized present seem more advanced. And tourism was booming. For the first time in history, middle-class people could afford to travel. The railroad system was expanding across Europe. People wanted to visit castles, see historical artifacts, and experience the thrill of touching the past. Museums and private collections realized there was money in catering to this appetite. A lot of money. But here's the problem. Authentic medieval torture devices were relatively rare, and the ones that did survive weren't always very visually impressive. A rack is basically just a table with ropes. Thumbscrews are small and easy to overlook. Even burning at the stake doesn't leave behind much in the way of collectible artifacts. What tourists wanted was spectacle. They wanted to see something that would make them gasp, something they could describe to their friends back home, something worth the price of admission. Enter the craftsmen and antiquarians of the 19th century, people who were happy to provide what the market demanded. Creating a fake Iron Maiden wasn't particularly difficult if you had metalworking skills. You built a human-sized cabinet, lined it with spikes, aged it with some chemical treatments to make it look older, and voila, you had yourself a priceless medieval artifact. Some of these forgers were probably fully aware they were creating fakes. They were essentially con artists, selling fraudulent items to gullible collectors or museums with more money than expertise. But others might have genuinely believed they were recreating something that had existed. Remember, Sibenki's story was out there, along with other vague references to spike torture devices. A well-meaning craftsman might have thought, "We know they used these things, so I'll build one based on the descriptions." They weren't forging, they were, in their minds, reconstructing. The most famous Iron Maiden, the one from Nuremberg, has been traced back to around 1890. Let me repeat that date, 1890. Not 1490. Not even 1590. 1890. It was likely assembled from pieces of actual medieval armor and other objects, then modified and combined to create what the creator imagined an Iron Maiden would look like. It's a Frankenstein's monster of medieval metalwork, stitched together from authentic parts to create an inauthentic whole. And it worked. People believed it. Museums bought it, literally. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden became one of the most photographed and reproduced images of medieval torture. It appeared in history books, encyclopedia articles, and eventually horror movies and video games. A fake became the real thing through sheer repetition and belief. So how did modern researchers definitively prove the Iron Maiden was a hoax? The evidence comes from multiple sources, and when you put it all together, the case becomes airtight. First, there's the documentary silence I mentioned earlier. The absence of medieval references isn't just suspicious, it's conclusive. We have torture manuals from the medieval and early modern periods that describe dozens of devices in excruciating detail. The authors of these manuals weren't shy about documenting cruelty. If Iron Maidens had existed and been used, they would have been mentioned. The fact that they're not mentioned anywhere before the 18th century means they didn't exist before the 18th century. Second, there's the physical evidence from the devices themselves. When researchers examined the existing Iron Maidens in museums using modern dating techniques, they found that the materials and construction methods dated to the 18th and 19th centuries, not the medieval period. For example, some of the spikes showed signs of machine tooling that didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Others used types of iron or steel that weren't produced until the industrial era. The joinery techniques, the types of nails or rivets used, even the design principles, all of it pointed to relatively modern construction. It's like finding a medieval sword made from stainless steel. It might look old, but the materials give away the truth. Third, there's the logical impracticality of the device itself. And this is where we need to think like medieval executioners for a moment. Medieval torture and execution methods were brutal, yes, but they were also practical. They used simple, effective tools that accomplished specific purposes. The rack stretched the body to extract confessions. The wheel broke bones as a form of public execution. Burning at the stake was a religiously significant punishment for heresy. But what would be the point of an Iron Maiden? If the goal was execution, there were much simpler ways to kill someone. A sword, an axe, a noose, all much more efficient. If the goal was torture to extract confessions, the Iron Maiden would be terrible at it. Once you're inside with spikes piercing your body, you can't exactly sign a confession or answer questions clearly. You'd probably be in shock, barely conscious. It's not a practical interrogation tool. If the goal was public spectacle, which many executions were, the Iron Maiden fails completely. The victim is hidden inside a closed cabinet. The crowd can't see the suffering. What's the point of a public execution if the public can't see it? The Iron Maiden doesn't make sense from any practical medieval perspective. It only makes sense as a horror device designed to shock and frighten people who are reading about it or looking at it in a museum. Fourth, and this is fascinating, researchers found evidence of the forgery business itself. There were 19th-century craftsmen who specialized in creating medieval artifacts for collectors. Letters and business records have been discovered showing orders being placed for torture devices, with specifications on how old they should appear and what features they should have. It was an entire industry built on fabricating the past. Now, just because the Iron Maiden was fake doesn't mean medieval torture was a myth. Far from it. The real methods used during the medieval period and the early modern era were just as horrifying as the Iron Maiden legend. Sometimes more so. Let's talk about what actually happened, because this context is important for understanding why the Iron Maiden hoax was so believable. The rack was absolutely real. This device stretched the victim's body by pulling their limbs in opposite directions. It was used primarily to extract confessions, and it was devastatingly effective. The pain was excruciating, and the damage to joints, muscles, and ligaments could be permanent. People confessed to crimes they didn't commit just to make it stop. The strappado was another genuine torture method. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and then they were suspended by their wrists. Sometimes weights were added to their feet. This caused intense pain in the shoulders and could dislocate the joints. It was used extensively during the Inquisition. Breaking on the wheel was a real execution method. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, and their limbs were systematically broken with a hammer or iron bar. After the bones were broken, the body was woven through the spokes of the wheel, which was then mounted on a pole and displayed publicly. Death could take hours or even days. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the most serious crimes, particularly treason. The victim was dragged through the streets, then hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still alive, and finally beheaded and cut into 4 pieces. This was the punishment given to people like Guy Fawkes in England. Burning at the stake needs no explanation. It was used across Europe for heresy, witchcraft, and other religious crimes. The pain was unimaginable, though sometimes executioners would show mercy by strangling the victim first or placing bags of gunpowder around their neck to speed up the death. And then there were the smaller-scale torture devices that don't get as much attention but were widely used. Thumbscrews, which crushed fingers and toes. The pair of anguish, which was inserted into body cavities and then expanded. Branding irons, whipping posts, and various forms of water torture. All of these were real. All of these were documented. All of these caused immense suffering. So why invent the Iron Maiden when reality was already so horrible? I think the answer is that the Iron Maiden represents a particular type of horror that the real devices don't quite capture. It's personal and claustrophobic in a way that public executions aren't. It's mysterious, you can't see what's happening inside, so your imagination fills in the gaps. And it's almost supernatural in its cruelty, like something from a nightmare rather than a courtroom. The Iron Maiden is what medieval torture looks like in our imagination, a perfect encapsulation of our fears about the past. But our imagination, it turns out, is not a reliable historian. Here's the crazy thing. Even after researchers definitively proved the Iron Maiden was a 19th century fabrication, the legend persists. Museums still display them, though many have updated their labels to indicate their alleged torture devices or 19th century reproductions. Some museums have quietly removed them from exhibits altogether, but others still present them as authentic medieval artifacts, either through ignorance or because they know it's what visitors expect to see. Books still describe them as real. Horror movies still feature them. Video games still use them as traps or execution methods. The Iron Maiden heavy metal band took their name from it. The legend has become self-sustaining, feeding on itself through popular culture. Why? Why does a proven hoax continue to have such cultural power? Part of it is simple momentum. Once a story embeds itself in popular culture, it's almost impossible to remove. How many people still believe that medieval people thought the earth was flat? They didn't. Educated people in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. How many people think Vikings wore horned helmets? They didn't. That was a 19th century invention, just like the Iron Maiden. Myths are sticky. They resist correction. Part of it is that the truth is less satisfying than the legend. 19th century museums created fake torture devices to attract tourists. Doesn't have the same dark allure as medieval executioners trapped people inside iron coffins filled with spikes. The hoax is boring compared to the horror. Part of it is financial. Museums that invested in Iron Maiden exhibits don't want to admit they were fooled. Tour guides who've been telling the story for decades don't want to change their scripts. Authors who wrote about them in books don't want to issue corrections. There's an institutional resistance to admitting the truth. But I think the biggest reason is psychological. We want to believe in the Iron Maiden because it confirms our assumptions about the past. We want to believe that we live in more enlightened times. We want to look back at history and see darkness so we can appreciate our modern light. The Iron Maiden gives us that. It's a symbol of how far we've come, proof that we're better than our ancestors. Except, here's the uncomfortable truth. The Iron Maiden tells us more about the people who created it in the 19th century, and about us today, than it tells us about the medieval period. The people who forged these devices were our relatively recent ancestors, living in an era of scientific advancement and industrial progress. And they created instruments of imaginary torture, then sold them as historical artifacts to satisfy a market demand for horror and spectacle. What does that say about human nature? About our appetite for darkness? About our relationship with truth? The Iron Maiden isn't unique. History is full of fabrications, forgeries, and myths that people believed for generations before the truth came out. Let me give you some examples because understanding these other hoaxes helps us see the pattern. The donation of Constantine was a document supposedly written by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, granting authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope. It was used by the Catholic Church for centuries to justify papal power. Only problem: it was a forgery probably created in the 8th century. An Italian scholar named Lorenzo Valla proved it was fake in 1440 by analyzing the Latin used in the document, which contained terms and phrases that didn't exist in Constantine's time. The Piltdown Man was allegedly the missing link between apes and humans, discovered in England in 1912. It was celebrated as one of the most important paleontological finds in history. Except it was a hoax. Someone had taken a human skull and an orangutan jaw, filed down the teeth, and stained them to look ancient. The forgery wasn't definitively exposed until 1953, 4 decades after its discovery. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a fabricated anti-Semitic text purporting to describe a Jewish plan for world domination. It was created in Russia around 1903 and has been thoroughly debunked numerous times, but it continues to circulate and influence conspiracy theories to this day. Despite being proven fake, it's still published and believed by some people. The Hitler Diaries were discovered in 1983 and initially authenticated by some experts. The German magazine Stern paid millions for them. Then historians examined them more carefully and found they were crude forgeries using modern paper and ink. The forger had even used modern glue that showed up under testing. What do all of these hoaxes have in common with the Iron Maiden? First, they all told people what they wanted to believe. The donation of Constantine justified existing power structures. The Piltdown Man confirmed British assumptions about human evolution originating in England. The protocols fed existing prejudices. The Hitler Diaries satisfied the appetite for Nazi-related historical discoveries. Second, they all had some element of physical evidence or documentary proof that made them seem credible. They weren't just stories. They were supported by objects or texts that people could examine. Third, they all persisted even after initial debunking because of institutional or cultural investment in the lie. People had built careers, reputations, or worldviews on these hoaxes, and admitting the truth meant admitting they'd been fooled. And fourth, they all tell us something about the era in which they were created, not the era they claim to represent. The Iron Maiden tells us about Victorian-era obsessions with medieval darkness, about the tourism industry's demand for spectacle, about the market for Gothic horror. It doesn't tell us anything real about the Middle Ages. And that's actually more interesting than the legend itself. So what should museums do with their Iron Maidens? This question gets at a larger issue in the museum world. How do you handle artifacts that turn out to be fake, or that were acquired unethically, or that represent harmful misconceptions? Some museums have chosen complete transparency. They keep the Iron Maiden on display but change the interpretive materials to explain that it's a 19th century fabrication, not a medieval torture device. They use it as a teaching moment, an opportunity to discuss historical forgeries, the Victorian obsession with medieval history, and the importance of critical thinking about sources. I actually think this is the best approach. The Iron Maiden is historically significant, just not for the reasons people thought. It's a real artifact of 19th century culture, a window into how that era understood and misunderstood the medieval period. That's worth preserving and discussing. Other museums have removed Iron Maidens from display altogether, either putting them in storage or getting rid of them entirely. The argument here is that even with corrected labels, the presence of the device perpetuates the myth. People see it, take photos, and share them on social media as medieval torture device, ignoring or forgetting the actual historical context. And some museums, unfortunately, still present Iron Maidens as authentic medieval artifacts, either because they haven't updated their information or because they know the fake story attracts more visitors than the true one. This creates a problem for visitors. How do you know what to believe? When you visit a museum, you're placing trust in the institution to present accurate information. But museums are run by humans, and humans make mistakes, have biases, and sometimes prioritize entertainment over accuracy. The lesson here is that healthy skepticism is valuable even in educational settings. Ask questions. Look for citations and sources. Be curious about when and how something was dated. Notice if the exhibit label uses words like allegedly or believed to be. Those are red flags that indicate uncertainty. And frankly, be skeptical of anything that seems designed to be maximally horrifying or sensational. Just like movies that claim to be based on a true story often take massive liberties with the truth, museum exhibits that emphasize shock value over context might be prioritizing the wrong things. Since the Iron Maiden legend is specifically associated with Nuremberg, let's talk about what was actually happening in that city during the medieval period. Nuremberg was one of the most important cities in the Holy Roman Empire. It was a major center of trade, craftsmanship, and culture. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it was renowned for its metalworkers, artists, and innovators. This was the city of Albrecht Dürer, one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. It was a hub of learning, commerce, and relative prosperity. Yes, Nuremberg had executions and torture like every other European city of the period. They had a dungeon. They had an executioner, a position that was both necessary and socially stigmatized. They used torture to extract confessions, as was standard practice across Europe. But the city was also developing legal codes that, by medieval standards, were relatively sophisticated. The Nuremberg trials are not the famous ones from World War II, but the medieval legal proceedings were known for being more systematic and documented than in many other places. The real story of Nuremberg is complex. A city that was both progressive and brutal, both cultured and violent, both innovative and traditional. That complexity is the actual history. The Iron Maiden legend erases all that complexity. It reduces Nuremberg to a single image, a dark dungeon with a spike-filled cabinet. It turns a real city with real people and real history into a Gothic horror setting. This is what myths do. They simplify, they dramatize, they erase nuance in favor of narrative clarity. And sometimes what we lose in that simplification is more interesting than what we gain. The real medieval Nuremberg had master craftsmen creating works of art that still survive today. It had merchants trading goods from across Europe and beyond. It had legal scholars developing new approaches to justice. It had families raising children, artists creating beauty, and ordinary people living ordinary lives. But we remember it for a torture device that never existed. The Iron Maiden hoax is part of a larger phenomenon. Dark tourism, the industry built around visiting sites associated with death, suffering, and atrocity. Dark tourism isn't new. People have always been drawn to places where terrible things happened. They visited public executions in their thousands. They toured battlefields. They sought out relics of violence and tragedy. But the 19th century saw dark tourism become a commercial industry. With the rise of leisure travel, entrepreneurs realized they could profit from people's fascination with death and horror. Torture museums opened. Ghost tours began. Displays of execution devices became popular attractions. The problem is that the demand for dark tourism content sometimes exceeds the supply of authentic historical artifacts. So the industry creates content to fill the gap. The Iron Maiden was created to meet market demand. So were many other medieval torture devices that you'll see in museums focused on this topic. Some are real, some are exaggerated versions of real devices, and some are complete fabrications. How can you tell the difference? Here are some red flags to watch for. If a torture museum has an unusually large collection of devices, be suspicious. Genuine medieval torture implements are relatively rare. A museum with dozens of different devices probably has some reproductions or fabrications. If the devices seem designed for maximum visual impact, be skeptical. Real torture tools were often simple and practical. Overly elaborate, theatrical-looking devices were probably made for display, not use. If the museum emphasizes horror over historical context, question what you're seeing. Good museums explain the legal, social, and cultural context of punishment and torture. They discuss who was tortured, why, and under what legal frameworks. Museums that just want to shock you are more likely to play fast and loose with historical accuracy. If there are no dates, sources, or provenance information, that's a huge red flag. Legitimate museums tell you where artifacts came from, when they were made, and how they know what they know. Vague labels that just say medieval or 16th century, without supporting evidence, should be questioned. None of this means you shouldn't visit torture museums or engage with dark tourism, but approach it with the same critical thinking you'd apply to any other source of information. Let's dig deeper into why we're so fascinated by devices like the Iron Maiden, even when we know they're fake. Psychologists who study morbid curiosity have found that most people experience it to some degree. We're drawn to darkness, to stories of death and suffering, to the extremes of human experience. This isn't necessarily unhealthy. In fact, it might serve important psychological functions. First, exploring darkness in safe contexts helps us process fear. When you look at an Iron Maiden in a museum or learn about historical atrocities, you're confronting frightening concepts in an environment where you're not actually in danger. This can help you develop coping mechanisms for anxiety and build emotional resilience. Second, learning about past cruelty can reinforce moral values. When we see what humans are capable of at their worst, it strengthens our commitment to preventing such things. The Holocaust museums serve this function. They preserve the evidence of atrocity specifically so we'll remember and hopefully prevent it from happening again. Third, dark curiosity satisfies our need to understand the full range of human nature. We are a species capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty, and understanding both extremes helps us understand ourselves. But here's where the Iron Maiden hoax becomes problematic. Fake atrocities don't serve these functions as well as real history does. When you believe a fabricated story about medieval torture, you're not actually learning about human cruelty. You're learning about Victorian-era imaginations of cruelty. You're not processing real fear, you're processing theatrical fear. You're not confronting actual history, you're confronting a myth. And myths, while psychologically powerful, can distort our understanding of the past in ways that have real consequences. For example, the Iron Maiden contributes to a broader misconception that the medieval period was uniquely dark and barbaric. This Dark Ages myth has been thoroughly debunked by modern historians, who point out that the medieval period saw significant advances in law, technology, philosophy, and culture. But popular culture clings to the image of the Middle Ages as a time of superstition, ignorance, and cruelty. Why does this matter? Because it affects how we understand historical progress. If we believe the past was uniformly terrible and the present is uniformly better, we might become complacent about injustices that still exist. We might think, well, at least we don't torture people in Iron Maidens anymore, while ignoring modern forms of cruelty and inhumane punishment. The truth is more complicated. Some things have improved, some things haven't, and some new forms of cruelty have emerged that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. The Iron Maiden hoax from the 19th century might seem like a quaint historical footnote, but it's actually incredibly relevant to our current moment. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, but also unprecedented misinformation. Fake news, conspiracy theories, manipulated images, and outright fabrications spread faster than ever before. And many of the same psychological factors that made people believe in the Iron Maiden make people believe in modern hoaxes. Confirmation bias. We believe things that fit our existing worldview. If you already think the medieval period was barbaric, you'll accept the Iron Maiden story without question. If you already distrust certain institutions, you'll accept conspiracy theories about them. Emotional plausibility. Stories that trigger strong emotions spread faster than dry facts. The Iron Maiden is an emotionally powerful image. So are many modern hoaxes and pieces of misinformation. They're designed to make you angry, afraid, or outraged, because emotions bypass critical thinking. The authority of images. In the 19th century, physical objects in museums carried authority. Today, photographs and videos carry authority, even though they can be faked or manipulated more easily than ever. Pics or it didn't happen is our version of it must be real. I saw it in a museum. The momentum of repetition. Once a false claim has been shared thousands of times, correcting it becomes nearly impossible. The Iron Maiden myth spread through books, postcards, and museum exhibits. Modern myths spread through social media, YouTube, and viral posts. Different technology, same problem. So what's the solution? The same critical thinking skills that help you evaluate historical claims help you evaluate modern ones. Ask where information comes from. Who's making the claim? What's their source? What evidence supports it? Be skeptical of things designed to trigger strong emotions. If something makes you very angry or very afraid, take a breath before sharing it. Someone might be manipulating your emotions. Check multiple sources. Don't rely on a single museum, book, or website. See if the information is corroborated elsewhere. Look for expert consensus. Individual experts can be wrong, but when there's widespread agreement among specialists in a field, that's significant. Be willing to change your mind. This is the hardest one. We all have egos. Admitting we believed something false is uncomfortable. But intellectual humility, the ability to say, I was wrong, is essential for learning and growth. The Iron Maiden teaches us that even institutions we trust, like museums, can be wrong. Even widely accepted facts can be myths. Even physical evidence can be fabricated. That's not a reason for cynicism or for rejecting all sources of information. It's a reason for thoughtful, engaged skepticism. Since we've spent so much time debunking a medieval myth, let's talk briefly about what the medieval period was actually like, because the reality is more interesting than the Gothic fantasy. First, the term Dark Ages itself is misleading and has largely been abandoned by historians. It was coined during the Renaissance by people who wanted to emphasize how enlightened their own era was compared to what came before. But the medieval period, roughly 500–1500 CE in Europe, was not a dark age of ignorance and stagnation. This was the period that saw the founding of the first universities. Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Bologna, these institutions of learning were medieval creations. Scholars studied philosophy, theology, law, medicine, and mathematics at a sophisticated level. This was the era of Gothic architecture, which required advanced understanding of engineering and mathematics to build those soaring cathedrals with their impossible-seeming stone arches and massive stained glass windows. This was when the foundations of modern legal systems were developed. Trial by jury, the presumption of innocence, the right to face one's accuser, these concepts emerged during the medieval period. Agricultural innovation during this time included the heavy plow, the three-field crop rotation system, and improvements in horse harnesses that dramatically increased productivity. These advances allowed populations to grow and cities to expand. Medieval scholars preserved and built upon the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, translating and commenting on works that might otherwise have been lost. When we read Aristotle today, it's often through medieval translations and commentaries. Yes, there was violence. Yes, there was torture and cruel punishment. Yes, there was religious persecution and war. But these weren't unique to the medieval period. They've been features of human society in every era, including our own. The medieval period was complex, just like every other historical era. It had brilliant innovations and terrible injustices. It had moments of great beauty and terrible cruelty, often existing side by side. But it didn't have Iron Maidens. And the fact that we've imagined it did, that we've needed to invent extra horrors beyond the real ones, tells us something about our relationship with the past. We want history to be simple. We want clear good guys and bad guys, clear progress from darkness to light. The Iron Maiden gives us that simplicity. It's a symbol of medieval barbarity that makes us feel better about our own era. But history isn't simple. It's messy, contradictory, and complicated. And engaging with that complexity, while more difficult, is ultimately more rewarding than accepting comforting myths. So what have we learned from the tale of the Iron Maiden? First, that physical evidence can lie. Just because you can see and touch something in a museum doesn't mean it's what the label says it is. Objects have to be interpreted, dated, and contextualized, and that process can go wrong. Second, that myths persist because they serve psychological needs. The Iron Maiden wasn't popular because it was true. It was popular because it confirmed assumptions, triggered emotions, and told a compelling story. Truth is only one factor in what people choose to believe. Third, that every era reinvents the past in its own image. The Victorian creators of the Iron Maiden weren't really telling us about the medieval period. They were expressing their own era's obsessions, fears, and fantasies. When we consume historical content today, we should ask, whose version of history is this, and what does it tell us about the people creating it? Fourth, that debunking myths is hard and often incomplete. The truth about the Iron Maiden has been known in academic circles for decades, but the myth persists in popular culture. Truth doesn't automatically win out over fiction. Fifth, that skepticism and critical thinking are valuable skills that apply across contexts. The same questions you should ask about medieval torture devices apply to news articles, social media posts, and claims made by authority figures. And finally, that reality is often more interesting than myth if we take the time to explore it. The true story of the Iron Maiden, a 19th-century fabrication created to satisfy tourist demand, which fooled experts for over a century, is more fascinating than the legend of a medieval torture device. It's a story about human creativity, deception, credulity, and the power of physical objects to shape belief. The real medieval period, with all its complexity and contradiction, is more interesting than the Gothic horror version we've imagined. And the genuine torture devices that actually existed, brutal as they were, tell us more about historical justice systems, power structures, and human cruelty than any fabricated Iron Maiden could. When we choose myth over reality, we might get a better story, but we lose the opportunity for real understanding. The Iron Maiden stands in museums as a monument to a torture that never happened. But maybe it should remain there, not as evidence of medieval cruelty, but as evidence of something else. It's evidence that humans have always been fascinated by darkness, that we've always told each other scary stories, that we've always been willing to believe the worst about the past. It's evidence that the line between truth and fiction is more porous than we'd like to admit, that respected institutions can be wrong, that everyone knows doesn't mean it's true. And it's evidence that sometimes the most important question isn't what horrible things happened in history, but rather, why do we tell ourselves the stories we tell about history? The Iron Maiden is fake, but the impulse that created it, our fascination with cruelty, our appetite for horror, our need to believe we've progressed beyond our dark past, that's real. And that might be the most uncomfortable truth of all. The next time you're in a museum or reading a history book or watching a documentary, remember the Iron Maiden. Not the device itself, but what it represents. A reminder that even our most trusted sources of information can be wrong. That critical thinking matters. That the truth is worth seeking, even when the myth is more satisfying. Because in the end, the torture device that never tortured anyone has taught us something valuable. That the human capacity for deception and our susceptibility to being deceived is just as important to understand as any actual historical atrocity. We didn't need the Iron Maiden to understand human cruelty. We had plenty of real examples. But we created it anyway, and that tells us something profound about who we are. So, was this story what you expected when you clicked on a video about the Iron Maiden? Did it surprise you to learn that one of history's most famous torture devices never actually existed? Here's my challenge to you. The next time you hear a historical fact that seems designed to shock or horrify, ask yourself, is this real, or is this someone's imagination? Is this documented, or is this legend? Question everything. Verify what you can. Accept that you might be wrong about things you were certain of. And if this video changed the way you think about history, museums, or the stories we tell about the past, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the truth about the Iron Maiden isn't just about a fake torture device. It's about how we understand our past, how we evaluate information, and how we decide what to believe. And in a world full of misinformation, those skills matter more than ever. Thanks for watching. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to go check if everything else I learned in school was also a lie.